She's at OU, being a painting major.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful place to paint. Welcome to Backtracking, the show where two old friends take a second listen to influential bands' catalogs track by track. I am J. William Hall.
And I'm Dan Fiden. We'll be taking this journey together, providing context, both personal and historical, on some legendary bands. For our second season, we've picked none other than pioneering indie rockers, American Music Club. All right, so J-Dub, here we are. Exciting, extremely special episode of Backtracking AMC Season 2. You've gotten through the first couple of episodes. We're talking about the early history of American Music Club, the first full-length album, The Restless Stranger, and I'm extremely excited because we have a couple of incredibly well-informed people who are going to give us all the details on the earliest days of American Music Club. Isn't that right, JW?
It is correct. We have here original American Music Club member Greg Bonnell. Am I pronouncing? Is it Bonnell or do you go?
Actually.
Bonnell.
Give it a French lilt there.
So when I was debating in my mind there for 5 seconds how to pronounce it, I was reminded of the band The Connells.
Oh.
You remember the Connells?
Yeah.
The Connells? And I thought they were the Connells for a really long time. So I think that's why I'm messing it up. Anyway, the second guest we have here is Columbus music indie legend Paul Nini, who Greg and Paul were both on the scene back in the early 1980s when Mark Eitzel was here in Columbus, Ohio, during his formative pre-AMC, pre-San Francisco era. And we have a bunch of questions.
I really appreciate you guys both agreeing to come and talk with us a little bit. So I'm just going to dive right in if it's okay with both of you. I think probably the first thing that I'm curious about that I'd like to hear you guys talk about a little bit is you both were kind of involved in the music scene in Columbus and kind of the, late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, when, the pre-American Music Club bands were just getting going. It seems, just based on the conversations that Joel and I have had, the things I've read, and some of the demos that we've listened to, like it was a really rich and kind of quite interesting scene for a city that, at least from my perspective, someone who is not a Columbus resident, and the closest I got to that was going to college outside of Columbus for a little while. Doesn't really kind of it isn't in the pantheon of like legendary indie music hotbeds, but maybe that's just my misunderstanding. So could you tell us a little bit about what it was like back in those days? What was the scene? Who were the players? What kind of music was everyone listening to? And what really gave birth to some of these like really interesting bands?
Maybe start with like what year did you guys kind of come to Columbus and like kind of start percolating around the scene?
Yeah. Well, let's let Greg start and then I can do mine after his.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I came down to Columbus. I started school at Ohio State. I guess that was, I'm thinking 79 maybe. And so I came down to school. I was going to be a percussionist. That was my major. And I lasted for 1/2 of 1 quarter. And I was living in the towers over by the river, and there were like 16 people per suite and stuff, and it was just a zoo. So I moved out halfway through and then dropped out. So then I was living in an apartment.
So you were actually like a percussion, like a music major? Were you playing? Were you in the marching band and stuff?
Yeah, I was in a marching band in high school, and I was in a drum and bugle corps in my high school years too. So that was like really precision drumming and stuff that we were doing. So that was good training, actually. But so I was living in an apartment with another guy that I knew from the drum corps. I had my drum set in the basement, and I was playing one day, and somebody was pounding on the door, and I thought, oh, I've pissed somebody off, and I went up to see who it was, and this guy was standing at the door, and he said, "Hey, is that you playing the drums?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, like, "Hey, you want to be in a band?" And he said his name was 0 Watts, and he was in the Blades. And he asked me if I wanted to come to a rehearsal with them. And so for whatever reason, I don't know, but I did go to the rehearsal. And so that turned out to be the second incarnation of the Blades. And the people involved were 0 Watts and John Petrick, or Johnny Go, as he was calling himself, and Brian Emsch, who was in RC Mob, rather. Anyway, so that was my introduction to like the Columbus band scene, just like playing with them. And then we only played like 2 or 3 shows, I bet, before the band just imploded. Zero was not a stable element, so it just stopped. Yeah.
So before we, there's so much I already want to dig into, but just a little context for everyone that isn't familiar with Columbus. Ohio State is in Columbus, and it is one of the largest universities in the country. Do you guys happen to know how big it was then, how big it is now? But it's like very, very large, right? 50,000.
Yeah. 50,000 undergrads, 10,000 grad students. Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is
town.
This is an incredibly large number of people in that kind of core creative, risk-taking, band-forming age group, to have in a city that, I would imagine in those days Columbus was somewhere around 500,000 people, 600,000 people. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. It seems like, just what I've heard about back in the day, because I didn't experience Columbus until the early 90s. But, 10 years prior, it seemed like, High Street, of course, was totally different then. This is the main drag that runs north-south through the campus. And, my impression is that it was just much more, it was dive bars and record stores and like just little venues all up and down High Street that, bands could kind of just form and play at any of them. And it, at least that's the impression that I've been given. It was just a much kind of more fertile grounds for people back then. Is that accurate, or am I romanticizing it?
No, that's accurate. I grew up in Columbus, and I did not go to Ohio State, but when I was in high school, the drinking age was 18, and you were able to drink what they called 3-2 beer, which really wasn't that much alcohol even. And it was very easy to just get into campus bars with something that kind of looked like an ID, didn't even have to really look all that good, because they were just going to serve you the watered down beer anyway. So that is the way it was, very much so.
And sorry, go
ahead, David.
I was just going to ask, and so Paul, when did you kind of start to get involved in the music scene in Columbus?
Not till after college. So I think Greg and I both graduated high school in 77, and I went later that year down to Oxford, Ohio, to Miami University, and did my 4 years there, come home and work in the summers. And the first band I played in was there in college, and it was a party band. We literally only played at parties, which was a good way to do that in that particular place. And then in 81, I came back home to Columbus, and the first band that I was with was a band called House Hearts, and that started in 82.
Okay. So in the sense that I have, and I'd like to ask about the Blades, but the sense that I have just from listening to some of the, very early kind of proto AMC or AMC related demos from like the Cowboys, for example, is this is like like very punk influenced. So was there much of a, maybe that's wrong, but that was my sense just kind of listening to it. Was there a pretty vibrant punk rock scene in Columbus in those days? Because that's pretty early on, at least it seems to me, for punk to kind of break through in a place like Columbus.
Yeah, I mean, Screaming Urge was going. They started sometime
exactly.
in the late 70s, I think. Um, you have Mike Rep, who was doing his lo-fi thing, the early Ron House stuff that started in the late 70s, like the Twisted Shouts and later Moses Carry Out. I mean, yeah, all that stuff was happening back then.
Did you feel like that was sort of the prevailing sound of like High Street Columbus, or was it broader than that? Like, were there just all different genres of bands and, people doing all kinds of different stuff?
I think people knew about what was going on in other cities, or knew about other, like, bands that were starting up that were interesting and stuff there. And, you could get their records and stuff too. So.
Yeah, I mean, back then, every city, was doing something with sort of underground punk, new wave, whatever you wanted to call it, and bands were pressing up singles and things like that. So it was pretty common.
And you mentioned Ron House when you were going through some of the folks involved with the scene. He's definitely someone who we've already talked about a little bit on the podcast, but it would be great if you could just kind of fill in the blanks on who he was within the scene and what kind of an influence he had on music in Columbus in those days.
Yeah, I mean, Ron is kind of a big deal. He worked when I was in college, and then right after college, he worked at Magnolia Thunder Pussy Records, which had all the imports and indie stuff. And then, the two bands I mentioned before, plus Great Plains, which was the band I was in with him later. Then on to Thomas Jefferson Slave Apartments, and then other stuff he's been doing since then. So, yeah, I mean, when a lot of people think about indie music in Columbus, they definitely think of Ron. There's no doubt about that. And he and Mark Eitzel were good friends and continue to be, from what I can tell.
Yeah, I think something we saw early on said that Mark had like named Ron as sort of an early spark or whatever, that, he saw Ron doing his thing and he was like, oh, I could do that, or something like that. I felt like the Cowboys to me sounded like, it didn't even sound like Mark Eitzel singing, it sounded like kind of a version of Ron singing.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, I mean, but I looked on Discogs where certain things came out because I couldn't remember. So, Cowboys came out in 1980, and that was sort of the beginning of post-punk at that point. Like there had been punk, and then there was, kind of new wave and post-punk and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, when you listen to that Cowboys single, like the one song has almost a ska sort of feel to it or something. The other one's more straight punk. And yeah, that very much tracks for that time.
And that single was that put out on, did Ron House have the label? Like, was it his label or was that something different?
No, that was for the Naked Skinnies record, right?
Okay.
Yeah, that was the Naked Skinnies one that was on that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, that Ron.
We've got to dig into that because there was some controversy that we had in the episode where we were talking about kind of the Naked Skinnies and the Cowboys, and that demo in particular. We were trying to figure out what label that came off of. But I don't want to, before we move ahead to that, what were some of the clubs, like the music clubs that all these bands would play in? I mean, was there a small number of them, or was it okay? Did everyone kind of all congregate in the same clubs? What was that like?
Yeah. I think Mr. Brown's was kind of a mainstay at that point. And it seemed like almost anybody could play there. I mean, you just had to, ingratiate yourself to the guy that owned it. But also Bernie's Bagels, and it didn't have the distillery there. It was just a bagel shop. But they were open late, and that's where the Naked Skinnies played first of all, and we played there with Moses Carryout several times. that was just a situation where we'd have to push tables aside and stuff and make a space to put our stuff. It was, I mean, they were pretty small shows, really.
Yeah, I mean, it was like less than half the size of what it became when they added the distillery bar side, which is where the bands moved over, once that happened.
Yeah.
I remember, being home for break and seeing a Naked Skinnies and Moses Carryout show at Bernie's, and then seeing a Billy Lee Buckeye show. Also,
really?
Yeah, which is what Mark Eitzel was calling himself when he did solo shows back then.
Yes.
That's funny.
Right. I think I had read about that somewhere, but I haven't, because just digging around on YouTube and trying to find, bootlegs of live shows. Like there's some really interesting, like early stuff, but I think the earliest Eitzel solo show that I could find was from like 86 or something. And it was at Bernie's.
And so, Greg, you joined the Blades. So was the Blades kind of was it a, how would you describe the music?
So it was very punk. 0 Watts was very like incendiary. He just tried to get a rise out of people and stuff. And he did like theatrics on stage, like he stabbed a doll and stuff like that. He was just trying to be, offensive to people and stuff. So, and then that we didn't last very long. It was just a matter of months. Then the last I heard from 0, he said he and his girlfriend were going to Arizona to move in with his wife. So I didn't hear from him after that. So
wow.
You don't know what became of him if he started a Arizona-based Blades.
maybe great things, maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, there's also another famous 0 Watt story where the Blades played outside of the Agora, which is now the Newport, when Lou Reed was playing there, and they just staged a performance on the sidewalk, essentially. And there's some photos of him climbing up onto the top of the building and getting on the roof and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
So one thing that I wonder about with that early scene, like if because I think of like Ron House's style of performance, and I think, the way you're describing 0, and like, was that kind of, I guess, common for like the front person to be more like confrontational with the audience, kind of, pushing the audience, making them uncomfortable sort of thing? Or do you think that was that a particular thing on the scene, or is that just like, there were a couple guys that did that?
Yeah, I don't think it was very many, guys that were like super confrontational. I think people tried to be like, at least pretend they were hardcore or something. But,
yeah.
But I think 0 was, I mean, that was part of his makeup. He just wanted to be, confrontational and stuff. I don't know. Ron House could be a little difficult.
Yeah, it would just depend on how much he was drinking that night.
Yeah, yeah.
When I was in the band, that was our thing. If we can just stop Ron drinking before the show, we'll be fine. So,
and actually, Mark was be very prickly too. Like if he wasn't getting a reaction that he thought was appropriate or something, he could be a real jerk about it.
It's really interesting when we were talking about some of these early Eitzel associated bands where you kind of hear him performing for the first time before American Music Club, and then when I've been relying on this book, which I've read a couple of times over the years. And there's definitely some description of Mark's performance style in his early days in San Francisco. And it does seem as though, I mean, these may not be the right touchstones, but we talked very much about the kind of, heavily punk and performance art influence of, or what it seems based on the description, what his performance influences might have been in those days. It seems like, he was maybe as much into like kind of you know, performance artists, the kind of Laurie
I think
Andersons of the
you
world,
mentioned Laurie Anderson.
as maybe he was also into some of the kind of, you know, well-known punk kind of agitator frontman type folks. Do you feel like that's fair, or is this something that comes a little bit more naturally to Mark? It's just kind of that's his personality, and he's just being who he is on stage.
I think he's I think it is part of his personality. I mean, not to be confrontational, but to, you know, I think he never wanted to be, he never wanted to appear to be like a phony or something. He, you know, it was like this was real to him and stuff.
Yeah.
But I also know when he was at Ohio State, he took a performance art class with Clara Crockett, and I think that kind of influenced him a lot too. Just like the idea of doing things as performance, you know.
Yeah.
But I think the music he was really sincere about too. I mean, I think that was like, I mean, he when he was performing the music, I mean, that was really him, and he was pretty deep into it.
So how did you kind of cross paths with him and wind up playing with him in Naked Skinnies? Are we ready to get into that?
I think we're ready. Yeah. Naked Skinnies, it's time.
Yeah, that's a good question. So after the Blades broke up, I played for a while with John Petrick and Brian Emsch, and a guy named Mick Divins was the singer, and we continued to be like sort of just a party band, playing Clash songs and old rock and roll songs and stuff. And through another friend, John Ryko, who wound up being in the Naked Skinnies, he introduced me to Mark and said that like Mark wanted to show him some songs or something. So I guess at this point the Cowboys would have been broken up. They would have not existed anymore. And so Mark was writing new songs, and he had met John somehow, and so they decided they were going to meet at John's apartment and like, you know, play the songs or something. And so John knew that I was a drummer and said, do you want to come over too? It seemed like real, just casual, you know, just like, why don't you come over? Maybe John was thinking like, why don't you come over and just protect me if in case something goes wrong or something.
So I don't get stuck for hours listening to this guy's songs. Yeah.
So I went over there, and then also Nancy Kangas, who was my girlfriend at the time, decided to come along for whatever reason. And we wound up in John's living room, this tiny apartment, and Mark was playing some songs, and John had I think John had a bass guitar, and then I had, you know, I must have known we were going to play or something, but I just brought like one tom and like a little cymbal or something and some sticks. Yeah. And I don't know why I only brought that much, but anyway, so we just sat around on the floor basically. Mark was playing the songs, and we just sort of played along with them. And John had a little reel-to-reel tape recorder, and we recorded some of that stuff, and that became like the beginning. I mean, it was just like we did those, and it was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And then, you know, from then on, it was like, okay, it's official, we're a band or something. And we did some more recordings just on little bad reel-to-reel stuff. And I think some of that stuff, like one of the songs was on the flip side of the single that we put out. So
the single is All My Life. Is that what it is?
Yeah, All My Life. And
I think I found that one, but I didn't find the flip side online. But, you know, my Google foo was failing me.
It's This Is the Beautiful Night or something. I can't.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
can't really remember. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
that sounds right.
And so those songs were just like reel to reel 8-track kind of recordings.
No, it was like a 2-track. It was just
Oh,
like
okay.
it was just like everybody gets ready and you turn it on and we all
Yeah.
play and then you stop it. And that was the amount of production that went into
Nice.
it. Yeah.
So
The thing that-
was there before we move on to that, like in these first conversations, it sounds like you guys just listened to the songs, obviously, but were there other conversations where you guys, I know that over the years as I've played in bands, that kind of first meeting, there's a lot of like, oh, you know this record? Oh yeah, I know that one, but do you know that one? And there's a lot of this trying to figure out what the touchstones are. Was there much of that? And if there was, what were the kinds of bands that you guys shared in common that felt like maybe they would be influences?
There wasn't a lot of talking about that. I know Mark was really interested in Joy Division at the time and like Echo and the Bunnymen and stuff like that. John Ryko was really into Pere Ubu and Devo and stuff. He was from Cleveland originally. I was interested in all kinds of stuff, like from Frank Zappa to like I don't know. Just like I liked real primitive stuff too, like just like old folk singers and things like that too. And Nancy's tastes were pretty much everything from children's records, like of folk songs, to like classical flute things and stuff. So we were a mixed bag, but it was just when we started playing, it was like just taking Mark's song as the guide and just sort of making accompanying parts for it, and so it worked out to be just it was pretty I don't know, just intuitive the way we worked it out. So it wasn't like heavy rock or anything, but it was rhythmic and stuff too.
Yeah.
Yeah, the All My Life single, like you can definitely hear the Joy Division kind of the tone shift from the Cowboys to this new thing, and I didn't know, like, and it's the first time that I feel like I can hear and be like, oh, okay, that's Mark Eitzel singing, like, because the Cowboys, it didn't even really sound like him. Did it feel like, I don't know, like the songs were like a step up, or more serious intent, or more kind of earnest?
Yeah, I'd say definitely. Yeah, to me, they seemed like much more like a higher caliber of song poetry and stuff. I mean, they were very impressionistic and stuff. I hadn't heard a lot of stuff like that before. I'd listened to some British bands and stuff, but yeah, I hadn't heard stuff that was like what Mark was playing. So yeah, it was pretty exciting. But at the same time, I don't think any of us knew what we were doing so much. It didn't seem like we were intentional. We didn't have a game plan for it.
So you started kind of gigging up and down High Street.
Oh, yeah, gigging makes it sound a lot more formal than it was. I mean, we'd like somehow we would get a show at Bernie's, and which probably was basically Mark walking in and saying like, "What is there anybody playing Thursday? Can we play Thursday?" And stuff like that. But there was one thing. This is kind of was known at the beginning too, and it kind of became the thing that rallied us to stay together and to work on songs, is that there was going to be a battle of the bands at Crazy Mamas, and Mark said, "We have to enter that." And we're like, we don't even know what the hell we're doing. What how could we do that? He said, no, this will be great. We have to do it. And so we practiced to enter the battle of bands. And he printed up a bunch of flyers that he put on High Street that said, Battle of the Bands at Crazy Mama's, we expect to win.
That's awesome.
What year would that have been?
We did not win, but we came in. We came in third, though. That was pretty fun.
How many bands participated?
I don't know. There were like 5 or 6, I guess. Yeah,
that's pretty good.
I have no idea who won, and I have no idea who the other bands were either. They were all like just hard rocking outfits and stuff.
Yeah.
And we were definitely the oddity of the night. So
yeah, I
so
think
Paul. I just
want to follow up on what Greg's saying because, yeah, I mean that's the way bands like Naked Skinnies and Moses Carry Out, etc. At that time, they were sort of under the radar and they were not playing like the more heavy rock kind of bars and that kind of stuff, which really appealed to me because that's the kind of thing I liked. And and Crazy Mamas, I'm glad Greg mentioned that because that was basically a dance club that was upstairs a little further on the South Campus, and they did have bands every once in a while. Like the Embarrassment from Kansas came and played really early on, like 1981 or something like that. So
played at Crazy Mamas.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And then Mr. Brown's not long after that. So yeah. And then the other person we should mention is Tim Anstad, who did the Offense fanzine and then the newsletter that followed. He was a big supporter of those kind of bands at that point, the sort of Columbus Underground. And he, helped with the Cowboys, I think, put out that single that they did. He was sort of their manager for a while and booked their out-of-town shows and that kind of thing. That was all part of what was going on at that same time.
And what was the name of the fanzine again?
Called The Offense.
The Offense. Okay.
Yes, and I think it came from the Tet Offensive, which was a Vietnam thing.
Yeah.
He kind of changed it around for the name of his fanzine. So
yeah. So there was kind of, I'm getting the sense that there was maybe a mainstream rock, maybe cover band crowd that was kind of the frat party crowd on High Street, and then there was this underground that, based on what you guys were saying, was definitely an underground but pretty vibrant. A lot of bands playing around, bands that local bands that are touring to kind of nearby cities and vice versa. So was there kind of any crossover between those two scenes at all, or they kind of kept to themselves generally? I'm thinking of musicians specifically. I'm guessing Hero wasn't playing in like a Journey cover band on the on the weekends or anything.
Not imagine that, no. But yeah, I mean there was some bands who were more from the sort of new wave side, maybe that were a little more popular, like Ronald Cole and the Trillionaires, for instance.
That's what I was thinking of too. Yeah, Ronald Cole.
Yeah, which if you haven't seen or heard them, you should look into those guys too. They put their first single and I think their first album out with Kurt Schieber, who was one of the guys behind School Kids Records, who was running a label back then as well. So
were there like multiple kind of like indie labels in town, or were labels just kind of popping up and going away, a release here, a release there, or was there kind of like competing factions?
Yeah, it was more popping up. And it was really just because somebody was a friend of the band and decided, well, I guess I can be the label, that kind of thing.
Yes, that's accurate.
So at some point, you guys, the Naked Skinnies, decide to move to San Francisco together as a group?
Well, no. Nancy and I decided to move out there first, and Nancy was the one who, chose San Francisco for some. It's a little blurry, the details, but she said she was going to go to San Francisco and she was going to try to work as a carpenter's apprentice. And she wrote letters to everybody she could find in the Yellow Pages at that time. And she went to the library and got the San Francisco Yellow Pages or something, and phoned them all up. And one guy said that he would hire her. And so she said, "Okay, I'm going to San Francisco." And
Wow.
I said, "Well, if you're going to San Francisco, then I should go to San Francisco too. That sounds fun, you know." And so we both moved out there, and she did work with this carpenter, but she had no carpentry skills, as he soon found out. And so she became his bookkeeper because he was a financial mess, and so that sort of worked out. But yeah, we were out there, and then Mark and John decided to come out too. And after they did, we wound up getting a house on sort of almost to South San Francisco that we could all live in. So we were all living there together. And then also somebody that I worked at the job I got out there was working as a bicycle messenger for a blueprint delivery company.
Oh, wow.
And so riding around downtown San Francisco, which I did not know well at all.
Yeah.
Anyway,
and those calf muscles. Yeah.
Yeah. And, yeah. So we all moved into this house together, which was, you know, the beginning and the end of the band, just having us all living under one roof.
All right, but before we go too much further into San Francisco, a couple of things that I want to kind of talk about before you guys actually make the migration out west. So the dynamic in the Naked Skinnies was there an kind of a single ringleader of the band? I mean, was there one person who really kind of took it upon themselves to schedule the rehearsals, book the gigs, do the flyering, whatever it is, or was that just kind of whoever had time?
I would say it was Mark. You know, I think Mark was definitely the directional part of the band, but he was very welcoming of us. You know, writing songs and stuff. We all contributed songs, and you know we performed everybody's songs at the shows and stuff.
He wasn't
but
like
as far as booking things, I think it was mostly Mark and maybe John a little bit. I don't remember ever like booking a show or anything. Okay. It was just always like, "Hey, we're playing at Bernie's tomorrow night." Oh, okay. So,
and then there was a we think, and this is something that I think we were reasonably confident about. We think that there was a demo recorded in Columbus, sometime relatively shortly prior to the move to San Francisco by Mark called "Mean Mark Eitzel Gets Fat."
Right. It was a cassette, I think.
Yeah. I found that on Discogs. Yeah, it's a cassette.
And so do you remember that very well?
I don't remember that one at all, really.
Okay.
I remember listening to it at some point, but yeah, I can't really recall what it was like.
Because that was one of the, I think, Jay William, when we were discussing the kind of prehistory of The Restless Stranger, that demo kind of becomes the first place that at least you can still find recordings of where the early versions of certain of the later American Music Club songs start to show up.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got the liner notes pulled up here. somebody published like a picture of the cassette liner notes or whatever. Greg, I swear I saw your name in there, like you played on it. Am I wrong about that?
It's certainly possible.
Well, the song list is not all of the songs are available online. I think like 3 of the 7 or something. But Swing Low, You Can Be Beautiful, Hold On to Your Love, which of course AMC goes on to do. I Speak French, A Tall Black Lady.
I
Do
Speak
these
French
ring a bell?
that was one we played at shows. That was a staple. It was, yeah. A couple of the other ones sound familiar. So, and it could be that they were recordings that we made in Columbus that I was playing drums on.
Yeah, I'm trying to read the thing, but it's sideways. But anyway.
Yeah, but it was a little unclear to us as well. It sounds like, there's probably good reason if you can't quite remember it either, whether this demo was recorded in Columbus kind of just prior to the move out west, or it was recorded early on in San Francisco. Because there seems to have been, well, we know for sure there was another demo that was recorded prior to The Restless Stranger that we think Tom Mallon that was his first involvement with the band, was that demo that kind of ended up being almost like a demo of the songs that wound up on, or many of the songs that wound up on The Restless Stranger.
Yeah. Yeah, because there was an early version of American Music Club that I actually played in, and I think a lot of the songs there was like a healthy overlap of like the songs that Naked Skinnies put together out there, and then when we parted ways, then I played with Mark a little longer in this first version of American Music Club, and we a lot of those songs came along with it too, and some of them like Mr. Lucky and stuff like that were on the first album too. We're on The Restless Stranger too, right? So,
yeah.
So that like Mr. Lucky was originally a Naked Skinnies song, or that was one that came after?
It's hard to remember the timeline. So when we lived together in San Francisco, we had a basement in the house, and John had like a 4-track, or maybe it was even an 8-track, like reel to reel machine, and so we had a pretty healthy habit of just going down and working on songs and recording parts and stuff, and we had quite a few songs put together. Then the house got robbed, and a lot of the stuff we were never able to recover.
Oh wow!
Most of the instruments we were able to get back. This is a weird story because we came home and the house was kind of a wreck, and it's like, oh, obviously somebody broke in, and then a lot of the gear was gone and stuff. And like a few days later, one of us was looking out the back window and said like, hey, that's our stuff over there in that house next door. It was like somebody living right next door had the stuff and left it like in plain sight, like in their window. So anyway,
that cannot be a true story. You mean
called the cops, and the cops were like, cops were baffled, and then the cops were saying like, well, we can't really press charges because they say it was somebody else that broke in and put the stuff there. So it was like this.
Wow,
this
that's a good
like,
one.
Oh, that's great.
It was just like a really dark comedy. But,
and that neighbor was Vudi.
that's the real ending. Yeah.
That is an amazing story.
Yeah, what a strange story. But
Yeah.
So Naked Skinnies is living in the house, and you guys were gigging in San Francisco at this point. Like you started kind of playing around there.
Yeah, we did play. We didn't play a lot of shows, but we played there. Well, we did play a show at the Fab Mab, which was like a big punk rock place. I mean, it was probably a few years prior to that was like it was a real like much more of a punk venue. And but we just played there one time, and there was a place called On Broadway that we played a few times. Oh, and at Hotel Utah, I think we played a show too. Anyway, yeah, we played some shows, but it was a grind in general, just like working and writing stuff and playing these shows, and not very many people were there and stuff, and then we were all driving each other crazy, living together in the same house and stuff. So it came to an end fairly quickly.
Yeah,
within a year or so.
In those days, there was it seems as though in that kind of first version that, and correct me if this is wrong, but based on the Sean Body book, there was a kind of a scene in San Francisco around a sandwich shop. Unfortunately, I don't have the name of this sandwich shop written down from the book, but the way that the author of that Sean Body describes it, that's where Mark, at least maybe you guys as well, kind of met Vudi originally.
I wonder what
he was in a band called the cow. I'm sorry,
the Farmers.
The Farmers. The Cowboys, the Farmers. Sorry for getting those confused. Yeah, the Farmers. At that point, this was kind of before he got involved, but somehow or another they crossed paths at this sandwich shop.
Well, the sandwich shop, it might have been there's a place over in North Beach that they had a acoustic new wave night or something, and Mark was going over there and playing songs and stuff.
Okay.
With some other bands. I don't know. I don't know what else it could have been. I just might not have known about it. But Vudi actually, I worked at the Blueprint Service Company, and he worked upstairs running a repro machine that made big Diazo prints for architects. So I just met him there at work, and I think we talked about music or something. So at some point I told him, hey, the band that I'm playing in is going to play a show at the Fab Mab. So and he said, oh, maybe I'll come or something. And so that was where he saw Mark for the first time, I think. And then, a few days later, he said, hey, I saw your show. That's the kind of music I want to be playing. The Farmers aren't doing it for me. So.
Oh, really?
So we just had like a little conversation about that, but he didn't say anything else. But that was right around the time that we were all getting sick and tired of each other in the band. So it worked out well for him.
Yeah.
You kind of like unwittingly
I
brought this to, wow, that's amazing.
Make the transfer. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember seeing, I think it was in the book maybe that you mentioned or somewhere else, where Vudi told a story about seeing Naked Skinnies, and you guys pretty much played one song for the whole set, and it was like one chord or something. And he thought that was like the greatest thing ever. But I have no idea if I'm remembering that correctly.
I don't think we played one song for the whole set, but it might have been that all the songs sounded pretty similar. I don't know. I don't recall it being a very receptive crowd, and I don't recall it being a great show on our part either. But
it made an impression on Vudi.
Yeah, I guess.
But that's an important point, is that this stuff back then, these kind of bands that we were playing in, we played to very small crowds, mostly friends.
Yeah.
And if anyone else kind of wandered in, they pretty much left. So, yeah.
Yeah. So you guys all moved in together, and it was just kind of classic roommate issues that ultimately kind of started to annoy everyone a little bit, and then you all kind of moved out of the house and everyone got their own apartments? Like, what led to kind of the dissolution of that version of your creative involvement with Eitzel?
Yeah, so we moved out of the house and everybody got an apartment. But Nancy and I were living together in the Mission, and so at that point, like before AMC got started, there was another guy that we knew, Brad Johnson, he was in the first version of AMC playing bass. But,
Yeah.
he and Mark had started like putting some songs together, and then I met them at somebody's apartment. Met up with them because Mark had some more songs that he was working on, and so Brad and I played on those, and they got recorded on a little like press the button cassette player. We recorded them with one of those, and I think those tapes still exist. There's a guy in England that has a lot of that early material.
I'm assuming these are the demos that I've heard on YouTube that are described as the Restless Stranger demos, but there's definitely a bunch of songs on them that are not on the Restless Stranger.
Yeah.
And stylistically, this is something that Dan and I talk about a lot. Like, they are all over the place. Like,
right.
Just like almost like a different genre sometimes from song to song.
Yeah, it's really interesting in those demos, and some of them actually pretty fully realized directions. And so it feels as though there were kind of multiple possible futures that American Music Club, kind of creative, like stylistic futures, it could have, paths that it could have gone down.
That sounds really accurate, because Mark was a pretty good chameleon at, like, he could take one of the songs and it could be like a loud, like really propelling kind of song, or he could like tone it back a lot and just have it be more of an instrumental thing almost. And yeah, I mean, he was good at figuring that stuff out. Also, Brad Johnson was a really great bass player, and he had an acoustic bass, so we did a lot of just sort of like quiet acoustic stuff too.
I was surprised by a couple of songs on those demos where they actually began with like a dancey bass. It was like a groove, in a way that I was surprised to hear from, something out of AMC. There's one called Blind Girl that sounded like a radio hit, like dancey bass line, and had these developed backing vocals and all of this stuff. But obviously that was a path not taken,
Fell in Love with a Blind Girl. Yeah.
Yep, that's the one.
Okay. So there's another, period of time that I forgot here, that it was like the first version of American Music Club, and it was Brad Johnson on bass. I played drums, Mark, and then there's another Mark on guitar, Mark Elliott, I think, and no, actually Brad wasn't playing bass. It was Jeannie Zudi was playing bass. Anyway, we met at this club called Clubfoot that was way out in a really desolate part of town, and I think somebody had a tape recorder, because I think there are recordings of these songs too. But like Mr. Lucky, we played that one, and that Fell in Love with a Blind Girl song, and there were a few others. And yeah, I think those are out there somewhere too. That those might be ones that the British guy has. So that was like the first version of AMC, and then and I said I wasn't going to do it anymore. And Brad, I think, had taken a job on a cruise ship for a while,
Yeah.
so he wasn't going to be involved. And so it sort of splintered apart. And that's when Vudi and Mark met, and then
and it sounds like
then it took off because Vudi had, Vudi knew like Sluggo and I don't
Bruce
know who else was
Caffin and
yeah. So that then it took off, and I think that moved pretty quickly. Then they started recording stuff more professionally at Tom Mallon's place.
Okay. And did you that's kind of the last thing that I wanted to cover before we kind of get back to what you guys did after AMC, but the Tom Mallon question. Did you know Tom when he first kind of interacted with these songs and Mark and everything? Was he somebody that you knew from the community?
Well, I only knew him through recordings that we did there, and that was because of that place where there was the acoustic new wave night. Somebody had decided that there should be recordings of those artists. So, they picked several of the artists that had performed there, and Tom was the studio guy who offered to like do the recordings and stuff. So Nancy and I were performing at that point as the Dave, and we went and played a couple songs and recorded them there, and Mark must have done some songs, and there was a couple called Buck and Bubbles that played at that thing too, and also the woman that was in Buck and Bubbles was also singing some backing vocals when we were recording out at Clubfoot too. Sorry, this is all like very very confused and scattered.
Flooding back.
That's kind of how it went down.
Well, I
in a
could
very
definitely
confused
hear,
and scattered way.
On the one demo for Blind Girl, there's definitely like a woman singing background vocals on the chorus there, and I didn't know if that was Nancy or if that was, maybe that.
I think that was Mona from Buck and Bubbles. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When did Danny come in?
So I think Danny, it was the second album, right?
Oh, okay. He's not on Restless Stranger at all.
I don't think so.
I think he is on Restless Stranger.
Is he? I thought that was all Brad, but I don't know.
Well, Brad is there, but he's described as the keyboard player.
Oh,
and Danny is the bass player on Restless Stranger.
Yeah, I believe that is it possible that he moved from keyboards? Wait,
bass to keyboards.
Bass to keyboards. Well, I don't know. I actually think this is in the book a little bit, but I can't remember exactly what it is. So I don't want to spew misinformation here. We're gonna try and get it right.
The drummer at the time of the album, it's Matthew Norelli is the drummer on Restless Stranger.
They called him Sluggo, but.
Oh, okay. That's who Sluggo is. Okay. Yeah. I heard you refer earlier, and I was like, I don't know who that is.
And so you Greg, you stuck around in San Francisco for a long time, or did you head back to Columbus relatively quickly after that?
That was.
I want to kind of re-intersect.
It was from 81. We went out there in 81, I guess, and then I came back in 86. So yeah, it was only 5 years. Yeah.
Okay. And in those years, so what's kind of happening in the mid 80s in Columbus? I know that Paul, you're in like a long list of bands in Columbus during those years, but has the scene evolved? Like when you get back to Columbus, are you do you dive right back in, or what does that all look like? I guess I should direct this at one person. Paul, why don't you talk about it first?
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I was, I got out of college in '81, and then was in my first band, House Hearts, for '82, '83, and then '84, '85 in Great Plains. And then in '86, moved to Chicago, and my wife and I moved to Chicago, and I went to graduate school, and we were there through '91, and then came back to Columbus. But we would come back to town pretty regularly because my family's here, and her family's in Northern Ohio. And yeah, I mean, things have definitely changed, and there were more bands and more places to play. Like, Stashes became a much bigger deal at that point. In my years in Great Plains, we definitely played at Stashes a fair amount. We would also, early on there were shows at Mr. Brown's and a few other places. But yeah, many more local bands doing original stuff, and occasionally making some records and that kind of thing. And definitely more touring bands, kind of, indie bands coming through quite a bit. Like Great Plains, we played with Replacements a couple times. We played with Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds at Stashes. We actually played with the Go-Betweens from Australia, which was
Wow.
like one of my dream things to have happen. Yeah. So yeah, so things definitely changed a lot. And a lot of it had to do with who I mentioned earlier, Kurt Cheever. He was the one kind of booking those bands along with the people that were running Stashes, which became Dan Dugan a little bit later. Before that, it was some other folks. But yeah, and then things just kind of progressed from there into the '90s. So
I found online some old GeoCities site that has a list of all of the American Music Club gigs, from like that early era. And I noted that, they always came back to Columbus. Like Columbus was always seemingly on the itinerary, because they didn't do like big extensive tours, early on, but in some cases it was like one-off kind of gigs. I think that '86 Eitzel show at Bernie's, it sounds like it was just like a one-off, like he kind of came back and just did a show because maybe he was visiting town or whatever. So did you maintain kind of what's that?
I think his family was here for a while.
Yeah,
I think maybe
his sister still lived here.
Yeah, so he would come around Christmas time, and occasionally, he would do a solo show or something. And yeah, the Music Club would definitely come to Columbus when they were out doing shows.
Greg, did you sort of maintain, like, he'd come back around and you'd get together and go see the show and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, generally I would go and see the shows. There were a couple times when he was back. I remember a time going. I mean, we'd just like go out for dinner or something, but. And then there was some kind of party at his sister's house at some point too. But yeah, he seemed like when he was in town, he usually was with his sister and whoever else. Yeah. But I didn't see him a lot, but I would always go to the shows when he came back.
I haven't heard,
because they were such a great band. I mean, it was just so fun to hear them play. Like once they were like mid stride, it was just like there were some Stashes shows that were just fucking amazing. Just really great.
Yeah, the first time I got to see them was when I was living in Chicago, and it was right after California came out. And I had heard the other records, and they had been to town, but I hadn't seen them. But it was a great show, and they were really, really on and, really together and all that kind of thing, which was interesting because, when I first heard Restless Stranger, it didn't do that much for me. It seemed a little unfocused and all that, but yeah, they definitely turned it around pretty quickly. So.
What do you happen to remember where that show was?
Yeah, that was at a place in Chicago called the Cubby Bear, which is still there. It's right across from Wrigley Field. And Sue Miller, who's married to Jeff Tweedy, She was booking there, and she had been booking at the West End, another club before that when we first got to town, and that eventually went to Lounge Acts.
Yeah, she owned Lounge Acts, right? Or was a
Yeah,
co-owner? Yeah.
she and Julia, her partner, they owned Lounge Acts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about. Jay William and I actually, right after college, lived about a half a block from the Cubby Bear. But
Oh,
it's difficult to imagine when we
Yeah.
lived there, a band like American Music Club playing at that venue.
Yeah. Yeah,
It was a
definitely
very-
by the time we were in Chicago, that venue was full on like rat rock kind of vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Lounge Acts, it was kind of in the heyday of Lounge Acts, probably.
Yeah, we saw a lot of good bands at Lounge Acts.
Yeah. So you guys kind of kept up with the albums. Did the direction that the band took kind of post Columbus, post, the earliest days, was it somehow predictable? I think one of the things that, this is probably too compound a question, but one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit already in the podcast so far is what seems to be a slow evolution of Mark's songwriting from fairly unstructured songs, meaning songs that don't really follow a kind of traditional verse, chorus, bridge kind of a thing. Frequently songs that almost feel like the band is kind of trying to force it into a more traditional structure, into much later in his career, kind of Everclear and afterward, what I would argue is kind of like a very traditional pop songwriting approach that he took. Is that something that you always felt was there in the early music and just hadn't been developed, or was that just a shift?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was always there from the beginning, but it's just like production got better and better too. Like arranging and production was by the time by the later albums, the production was like incredible. And like Mercury, I mean,
Mercury
is one of my faves for production, and that was. But I talked to Mark at some point around that time, and I said that I really liked it, and I mean, this was always how Mark was. He was always like, "Oh, it sucked. It sucked." It was, he had the habit of doing that, but he said even though it came out really well, he maybe wasn't as comfortable with the recording process or something. I don't know. But yeah, I feel like they just continued to improve like over the years. It was great.
Yeah, to me it seemed like a pretty natural progression,
Yeah.
And especially being on a major label, like when, Mercury and some of those other records. I mean, I'm sure he was getting some, pressure to be a little more commercial and, that kind of thing. But, Mark Eitzel commercial is, really not all that commercial. So, yeah, I think Mercury is kind of like peak AMC myself. I really love that record. I just listened to it the other day because we were going to do this. I wanted to hear it again. So, but yeah, the one that really got me for them though was California. I thought that was a major leap, and there's so many great songs, and that remains one of my favorites as well.
Paul, you had said that The Restless Stranger, when it first came out, you were kind of like,
Yeah.
I'm interested, Greg, based on being involved, with some of the early iterations of the songs that wound up on the album. Like, what was your impression when you first heard the finished product?
Yeah, when I first heard that, I was really impressed because it was like they'd moved up a notch. I mean, just the production and everything was like so much. It was more than we'd ever done before. So, it just seemed like, wow, this is a real record.
And did you feel like because that record is more kind of all over the place genre wise? But now after I listened to all the demos and everything, I'm like, that must have been a monster to whittle into just that collection given the super wide range, like, were you surprised at sort of the trajectory that their overall sound and aesthetic took, like from Restless Stranger to Engine to, deeper into the Americana kind of vibe? Like, was that surprise to you, like when they could have gone all these different other directions?
I guess no. It wasn't surprising, but it was. But it always was. It always was like, oh wow, this is really good, and so it is surprising in that way.
Yeah.
But it made sense. I mean, it made logical sense, and it sort of seemed like a good thing. Like, oh, this is what I feel like Mark always, dreamed of being able to do, like to, really make these songs into something, really kind of majestic and cool and stuff. Also, when I was kind of surprised when, like, when he was doing more like fingerpicky kind of acoustic guitar stuff, I was like, wow, when did you learn how to do that? And he was like, I've been doing it for a long time, but I think we just never recorded it well or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, he used a lot of different tunings too.
Yeah, I think he fell really hard for Nick Drake records and stuff at
Yeah.
some point, and that was like a big influence on him.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
And it opened up a different avenue of writing or whatever. Yeah.
And so one thing that we've talked about quite a bit in the podcast so far is the bands that were influenced by American Music Club. It's such a, I think, over the course of the albums, they're really pretty singular albums. But it does feel as though there are maybe some obvious and I think well-known bands that are influenced by American Music Club or cite them as an influence, like Red House Painters. But when you guys listen to it, kind of seeing the, being involved in the scene, playing in bands that played with the bands that listened to them and, being in the band and Greg, in your case, who are the bands that you kind of like look at and think like, wow, they really, they must have listened to a lot of AMC, when they were 18, 19, 20.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I don't know who to say. But I do occasionally hear stuff like that, but I can't think of any. And it's probably just because, I don't know, you sort of feel like, I pay attention to AMC in sort of a different kind of way than I do other bands or something. It's just like, oh, I'm like kind of looking for other details and stuff. I don't know, just because of memories and stuff.
Yeah. What about you, Paul?
Well, yeah, other than Red House Painters, I can't think of anyone that seems that close to AMC.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's people that I like a lot, like Joe Pernice and the Pernice brothers, that I think they're influenced, but they're not like doing anything that sounds that much like American Music Club. It's just more kind of a feel and quality of songwriting and production and that sort of thing that seems kindred or whatever, if you will, which to me makes more sense. So
yeah, those were Red House Painters and Scud Mountain Boys are the two that the Joe Pernice's previous band or whatever. But I think that's one of the surprising things that I've realized, like revisiting AMC, is just that like at this moment in time, they don't seem to have like a profile out there anymore. It's like the knowledge of them has evaporated, and they had, not that they were ever having huge hits, but Eitzel got named Songwriter of the Year, in Rolling Stone at that's kind of a peak moment. And so I guess I'm surprised that like at this moment, it doesn't feel like their legacy is very well known,
I think one of the things that got kind of Jay William and I excited about doing this together was there's been this really fun thing to watch, at least for me, of like, Gen Z kids, listen to us, listen to me. But you know what I mean? People in their 20s are rediscovering slowcore, which was something that Jay William and I, when we were in college at the radio station, we got really into. He introduced me to American Music Club, but we were really into like Acetone and Low and Idaho and a lot of these bands that, Codeine, in and around that, Red House Painters, right? In and around that time. And there's been this really interesting kind of resurgence in interest in like Acetone and, some of the Codeine, some of those bands from that era. And I don't hear as much about AMC, but I am absolutely convinced that if we can get them to listen to some of Backtracking, maybe they'll appreciate it, because it really feels to me like if you kind of go through the family tree of who were all of those bands listening to, I strongly suspect that they all were big American Music Club fans, as they were just getting started.
Yeah, I would agree. And, it's interesting you mentioned Acetone. I really liked their records when they came out back then, and I'm really happy that they've been reissued and there's a new appreciation and all that. And I agree. American Music Club is due for that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
We'll start here.
You guys have been really, really generous with your time. And it's been really fun to chat with you about this. It's been a real thrill for me. To hear some of the backstory and we're thrilled that you guys were agreeable to come and do this with us.
Sure. It's been fun.
But before we wrap up, I what are your current projects that you guys are involved? Because you're still involved. You're out there doing music. So maybe you can give a rundown of what you're kind of working on these days.
I'm playing in a band, Moviola, now, and so that's been for a number of years now. But and we're I think we're determined to just keep recording and cranking out new albums and stuff. And
You've got stuff in progress now. I liked your last single, Hillbilly Effigy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There's a new album that's almost done, so that'll probably be coming out in some form.
And you afterwards we'll put the links to the albums or your X account or Bandcamp account, whatever it is. We'll put them in the show notes. Everyone can go check them out. What about you, Paul?
Current band, Closet Mix, with my brother and some other folks, mutual friends with Greg. And we put our last record out, I think it was end of April is when that came out. Full edition CD and Bandcamp and streaming and all that. And I run the old 3C label group that at one point we got all of the older Moviola stuff out there to the streaming services. And JW here, is that what we're calling you? His label is part of the group as well. So yeah.
Full disclosure.
Well, listen, guys, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been great. JW, I appreciate you taking the time as always. It's been a real treat.
And I appreciate you taking the time as always.
Listen, I got nothing but time, guys. I got nothing but time.
Mutual appreciation all over the place.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
It's great.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and talking about AMC with us. We are the only podcast on the internet voted to going into super detail about the prehistory of American Music Club.
You got a niche. Yeah.
So,
that's good. That was fun.
Thanks. If you want to get in touch with us, please check out the show notes to see all the links for what these guys are up to today. If you want to get in touch with us, it's Backtracking Rocks at ROX at Twitter, Backtracking Rocks ROX at Instagram, Backtracking Rocks at gmail.com. Our Reddit account is Backtracking Rocks. Guys, It always is ROX. It is never ROCKS. Come on. Why would we do it that way?
So much cooler that way.
Come on. So much. We're totally in touch with the kids, y'all. Tune in next week. We are going to be back. We are going to be diving into Engine.
Can't wait.
Stay tuned. See you all next week. Bye-bye.